Hi everyone, I am Chirag Thakkar, Commissioning Editor at Roli Books, and you're watching Roli Pulse, a digital initiative by Roli Books. Since the lockdown began, we at Roli have been bringing you panel discussions, book talks, live sessions with your favorite writers, with people across the arts, culture, and economy, journalists, sports persons, among many others. Remember, you can check out all our previous sessions on our YouTube channel, our Instagram handle on our IGTV, that is, as well as on Facebook and Twitter. If you want us to put out more such content, then show us your love, type in your comments in the comment section below, share this with your friends and family and anyone who might be interested. For over several weeks now, about 1/3 of the planet, with some 2.6 billion people around the world, have been in some form or the other of a lockdown. What has been arguably called the world's biggest psychological experiment has affected each of us in many varied ways. As the world grapples with the COVID-19 pandemic, comes to terms, with its rampant and disastrous effects, waiting expectantly for a vaccine and or a thorough treatment that indeed works, the lockdown has already taken a severe toll on so many of us. While we well know now of the long and cyclical effects of post-traumatic stress after having experienced, if one has, conditions of war, disaster, military occupation, violence, poverty, loss of liberties and freedoms, the long-term impact of COVID-19 on our mental health remains to be seen. This makes having a conversation on how to be better prepared in and importantly after the lockdown an absolute must. I'm very pleased to say that we have one of India's best therapists, mental health professional, a coach, speaker, trainer, Anna Chandy with us, talking about mental health in the lockdown with journalist and policy consultant Pragya Tiwari. Today, with over 25 years of experience in the field of mental health, Anna is the chairperson on the board of the Live, Love, Laugh Foundation. The child of a dysfunctional family and an early sexual abuse survivor, Anna has healed from the battles of her past to rewrite her story. She is also the author of Battle in the Minds and has a podcast coming up very soon, which is going to be called Mind Your Mornings. We have, of course, Pragya, who's a journalist and policy consultant with over 15 years of experience in journalism. She's led publications such as Vice India, Tehelka, The Big Indian Picture as an editor, and has contributed her writings and reportage to several Indian and international publications such as HT, Mint Lounge, Elle, The New York Times, and Al Jazeera. So welcome to Roli Pulse, Anna and Pragya. I'm very pleased to have you both here. Please enjoy this conversation. And I'm just going to have Pragya take over and dive right into the discussion.
Thank you, Chirag. And once again, welcome to Roli Pulse, which is a fantastic initiative by Roli Books. Like Chirag mentioned, my name is Pragya Tiwari. I'm a journalist and I'm a writer, and I am greatly privileged to be speaking with Dr. Anna Chandy about one of the most important conversations that we all need to be having right now: how to deal mentally and emotionally with whatever's going on in the world and its many different manifestations, all of which are weighing on us and are creating a lot of uncertainty and distress. So without further ado, I'm going to dive right to it because I have a lot of questions for Dr. Chandy and I want to get on with it. So welcome, Doctor. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, Pragya. And let me start by asking you and requesting you to call me Anna so that it kind of becomes an informal, easeful discussion among us.
Done. So Anna is yes. Anna, the first thing I'm going to ask you is that a lot of people listening to this conversation, around the world or definitely in this country, might never have previously been diagnosed with any kind of mental illness, be it depression or anxiety. And therefore, they may not actually be able to tell the symptoms of a lot of what they are experiencing, feeling perhaps that it's natural to be somewhat out of sorts in a situation like this. Could you please help us in trying to understand what might be some of the symptoms to look out for when it comes to depression and anxiety, and also the link between these two things, which are often seen to be actually disparate conditions?
So let me start by saying that clinical depression and anxiety are sisters. They come hand in hand. Most often one comes in with the other. And then let me also clarify that when we talk about depression in our day-to-day language, saying I'm depressed, it's actually just saying I'm of low mood. Whereas clinical depression is a mental illness condition. It's a mood disorder. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to give highlight of some of the prominent symptoms that happens first with anxiety, and then I'll share what happens with depression so that people are able to understand and relate to some of these predominant symptoms. When people suffer from clinical anxiety, very often they constantly have this feeling of anxiousness. And the anxiousness is not proportionate or in relation to what is happening in their context. It seems exaggerated and grandiose. That's one symptom. They also have issues with regard to sleep. They take very long either to go to sleep, or when they sleep, they keep waking up. There's constant fatigue, physical and body and mental fatigue. And it's not that they're burnt out, but there's a general sense of fatigue. Some people with anxiety also have wide ranging fears that very often lead into phobias. Phobias and fears can be with space, height, water, insects, animals, social phobias, a whole set of phobias. Some people have physical symptoms in anxiety. They're constantly feeling, and they keep saying, oh, I feel that my heart is just dashing across my chest, and they can feel the thumping. It's almost like a heart attack. And when it happens very often, it becomes like a panic attack. Then you have people actually complaining about this feeling in the stomach, constant butterflies in the stomach. So these are varying kind of various feelings that people exhibit in clinical anxiety. Then let's look at depression. Depression is first apathy. There is a general sense of apathy. There is a feeling of doom. The way you view the world, the lens that you view the world is very dark. You feel a very deep sense of loneliness. And this loneliness is felt even when you're in a group or in a crowd. You still feel alone. People have some physical symptoms that they say that they wake up in the morning with this pittish, dull feeling in the stomach, and that feeling is kind of conveying to them gloom and despair. People have other symptoms of running stomachs, queasy stomachs, headaches, migraines, body ache. You also have a lose interest in whatever you were doing. Suppose you had a hobby that you used to be really excited about. It doesn't excite you anymore. Some people keep on feeling these just tears just flowing down. They're constantly sad. Then you have people who are actually all the time very angry. So there are varying feelings in depression. And what is important to understand depression and anxiety as clinical illnesses is that they also have a cultural texture to it. And that means that some of the symptoms that surface in depression and anxiety manifest according to the culture that we are in. For example, in India, clinically depressed men very often show signs of depression by being angry all the time. And because we associate depression with crying and sadness, we don't really relate to it. It's a very complex kind of illness, depression and anxiety, and it's not so linear. But what people can do, or the layperson can do, is any of these symptoms that I've shared with you, if you have 2 or 3 of those symptoms, and they have been consistently surfacing for 2 to 3 weeks, it's important that you seek professional support. Okay? Because if you seek timely professional support, your recovery is also much quicker. The longer you don't deal with this and you don't take the support, the longer the recovery process. And then if you don't deal with it, it becomes what we call chronic. Okay.
Now, we started by talking about those of us who may be experiencing a lot of these things for the first time and therefore are not quite sure whether to take this seriously or just think about it as something that's going to pass. But there may be some listeners who have previously been diagnosed with anxiety or with depression and have some history of having lived through it or even recovered from it. What kind of triggers might they be facing at this point in time, and what advice would you give to them?
So the best practice when individuals are diagnosed with depression is actually to work with a psychiatrist and a therapist, and they both work collaboratively. What the therapist actually does is the therapist works with the patient or the client during the treatment process to explore early childhood wounds or trauma that may have contributed to this individual, and where because of it becoming a contributing factor in the later years, normally adolescence and later years, this surfaces as depression and anxiety. Now, what happens in the therapeutic process is during this exploration, we understand these early wounds and these early triggers, and the therapist brings it to your conscious awareness, because the idea is that some of these early wounds have certain patterns which become triggers. So, for example, let me illustrate with you. If you've had an early psychological wound of living with parents or in a family situation where everything was about control. And what happens with control is that the feeling of control has caused you a lot of psychological pain. In the lockdown situation, because we have memory recall, and the memory recall is in our viscera, in the cells of our body, any similarity to control becomes a trigger, because intellectually we know that this lockdown is to actually provide safety and protection from the virus for us, but our emotional unconscious self has no capacity. All its capacity is in memory recall, the feeling of being controlled. So we naturally feel, the pain, the old pain of control, and this becomes a trigger for people in their current context of the lockdown. So again, normally what we say is when people have been diagnosed with depression and anxiety, when you work with the therapist will help you understand your triggers, and also between the therapist and you will work co-creatively how to manage these triggers. So, for example, in our practice, we encourage all our clients that if you're experiencing any triggers, even if you haven't been seeing us for some time, to please reach out so that we work through this. And it's very, very important, because one of the things that we need to remember is that we can manage and cope with whatever fears or whatever triggers we have if we make meaning of it, because human beings are meaning making animals, and very often it becomes extremely difficult for us to manage and cope with these triggers because we've not made meaning. And the therapist will provide the support, the psychological safety for this person to to make meaning of these triggers.
I was wondering, Anna, if this could also apply to situations where people have been suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, or any kind of traumatic, for example, the thing you said about control made me think of a lot of sexual abuse survivors who might suffer from PTSD and definitely feel safer when they feel in control. And the lockdown situation is, of course, a situation in which we are all feeling that we no longer control what happens to us when we'll be able to get back to work, whether we'll be able to put food on the table for the next couple of months. So I was wondering how this relates to whatever you said about depression and anxiety, whether that extends to trauma as well.
Yes,
what are your thoughts on that?
Yes, it does. Because let me first tell you the early psychological wounds. There are 5 categories of it. One is smothering and controlling. Even smothering is a part of being in control. It creates a psychological wound. The other one is abandonment. Abandonment can be physical abandonment or psychologically unavailable for the child. Physical abuse, sexual abuse, and emotional or verbal abuse. These are the 5 wounds. All these 5 wounds cause a form of trauma. What is trauma? It's a condition and an experience that we have because of severe distress, and we are not able to manage that painful experience. So when we talk of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, PTSD is a mental condition because we've experienced a distressing situation or had a distressing experience, and it is much beyond our control, and we actually experience emotional wounding and pain. Our brain cannot separate that this is an earthquake now that I experienced, this is a tsunami, this is sexual abuse. All that the brain knows is I need to be hyper vigilant. I need to be in flight, fight, or freeze, which is our form of coping with any form of people, coming into our boundaries or into our space. And therefore, during this time, just imagine for individuals who've had any form of sexual abuse, or any form of physical abuse, or even control. Now, imagine what you're experiencing when you're locked into these spaces with people and these old memories start triggering. And what happens, as I said, memory recall has positives and negatives. Positive is what we use, we need recall, we need for our learning, etc., in our day-to-day activities. But recall also means, as I said, the cell recalls. And the recall in trauma is with our senses. For example, it's known that smell, our sense of smell is the most powerful sense to recall traumatic experiences, because that smell, the meaning making associated with smell can never be edited by the intellect. So there are people who actually, with a sense of smell, they get flashbacks. Okay? So while again I'm saying intellectually, I know that I'm in lockdown because it's for my safety. But psychologically, my cell is not able to separate. All that I experience is lockdown, no escape. In sexual abuse, and me being a survivor, you actually are hyper vigilant all the time because you've experienced violation. And you've experienced violation, from people supposedly in the family who were supposed to protect you. So the meaning making and the understanding of family itself is different for a victim of sexual abuse.
Anna, before we move on from PTSD and trauma, there's a very unfortunate shadow pandemic on the rise alongside the COVID-19, and that is domestic abuse and sexual abuse. A lot of people might be experiencing intensified domestic or sexual abuse at this point in time, or maybe actually experiencing it for the first time, physical abuse from previously maybe just verbally abusive partners or other members of the family. We've seen a spike in the number of reported cases, even in a country like India, where we all know that there's gross underreporting of cases of domestic violence and of sexual violence within families. Now, as you yourself know, when somebody is being sexually abused or they are being physically abused within families, your first sort of impulse is to try and protect yourself physically, to try and ameliorate the physical distress of the situation that you are in. And often, for a very long time, you do not even consider the psychological impact, medium term or long term, of what you are going through. Any word of advice for women or children or men, for that matter, who might be going through domestic and sexual abuse at this point in time, either for the first time or in a recurrent fashion?
I think the first, I think I need to set a context and help people understand this. First is that people who have been experiencing this, most often victims of any form of abuse, what happens is it takes a while because their sense of self is completely vampired. Okay? And it is completely vampired, and they actually are so, have so powerless in actually believing that in two firm beliefs. One is that I deserve better and I can do something about it. When I say do something about it, that I can have a different life. So that group of people during the COVID, in a way, what happens to them is they have actually been at some level what we call living in denial. Denial that how destructive this is for them and that they can have a way out. So that's one set of people. For the people who are, this is happening for the first time because of the lockdown, they are in a complete state of shock because this is something really unprecedented and they don't know the way forward. To both groups of people, I would say you need to reach out to somebody else first. You need to reach out, and you need to reach out even if it means neighbors. Because one thing in this country, if you reach out to your neighbors, they can call the police. They're calling the police only to actually bring to the awareness of the perpetrator that it has been noticed and it's been observed. Because this, perpetrators, the reason why they perpetuate this is because of our cultural system, where the value and the importance of the collective, which is the family value, is much more important than the health, emotional, physical, and spiritual health of the individual, that we tend to protect the family and therefore not actually share this outside. So it's very important to bring it out. The second thing it's important is to actually have some boundaries. When I talk about boundaries, yes, that needs to be worked in therapy in a much deeper way, but immediate boundaries is actually to actually not engage too much with this person, okay? Because this person is already in this hypervigilant, high stress, and so any trigger will activate them to actually perpetrate. And the third thing is to start maintaining a journal, because what we need is to see the patterns. when we can get out post the lockdown and the person can actually take help. At this point, these are the 3 immediate steps that need to be taken, keeping in consideration that it's the COVID time and we are under lockdown. Post lockdown, I think it's a time that this is addressed. Okay. In India, let me tell you, Pragya, especially with sexual and domestic violence, because of this need in the culture to protect families, we actually, in a way, encourage and perpetuate perpetrators to continue, destructive behaviors.
In fact, a survey from the National Family Health Survey, the results said that 52% of women think it's okay for their husbands to beat them. And in fact, only 42% of men think, well, not only, but relatively lesser number of men think that it is okay for them to beat their wives. So social conditioning is cultural conditioning, and social conditioning runs quite deep. But I wanted to move on to a slightly different emotion from the one that we are talking about. And I was wondering, Anna, if some of what we might be experiencing at this point in time could also be shades of grief. And I know that we normally associate grief with loss of the death, usually, of somebody who was very dear to us, or perhaps even the loss of a relationship. And obviously, while some people could have lost somebody to the illness or whatever, most of us, fortunately, at least in India, haven't. However, could there be shades of grief in what we're feeling at this point in time?
So this is a time of uncertainty. And uncertainty is always, there is loss. And when there is loss, there is grief. The loss for people during this time is diverse, and the loss is varied according to according to demographics of gender, culture, sex, socioeconomic strata, etc. But there is loss. For some people, there is economic loss. For some people, there is loss of relationship. For some people, there is loss of their careers, loss of jobs. I was talking to a set of university students, and they were MBA students. They're already experiencing loss because they had campus recruitment. Now they've got letters that's not taking place. So there's loss of a future. There are loss of dreams. And one more common, what we've all lost is we've lost our old lives. When we emerge out of this post-COVID time, it is a new normal. So there is loss. And when there is loss, there is grief. The intensity of the loss is varying, and therefore people are at different stages of grief. But there is loss, so it's very, very normal to grieve. And it's okay to grieve, because when you grieve, in a way, you're accepting the loss and you're accepting a reality of yours, which will in a way help you move forward, because unresolved grief, it internalizes in our system and then it morphs into some other defensive behavior, which will show up in our later life.
Even another, this is it's a very strange time. There's so much of external distress. There's this fear of catching an illness. There's economic loss that all of us are dealing with at some level or the other, uncertainties, etc. And then we're sort of locked in with our families, with maybe our spouse or our children or whatever it is. And even in relationships which were previously healthy, this can cause a lot of strain. And because particularly those relationships have been relatively healthy before, couples or family members may not have the tools to actually understand or deal with the sudden strain that they find, friction that they find in relationships at this moment in time. What would you like to say about that?
So I would actually categorize relationships into two, just like broadly.
Yeah.
So I would say living relationships and existing relationships.
Yeah.
Living relationships are actually relationships that have been healthy pre-COVID. And, you have the regular arguments and the regular fights, and it's all part of the growth of the relationship. But there's a fair amount of intimacy and what I call open communication and, intimacy, and also the ability to expose our vulnerabilities. Those are living relationships. Then we have relationships, what I call existing relationships. These are relationships that were just surviving, but under the surface, there were many issues that we've not dealt with, and we are in denial. And now, what has happened with the lockdown, all these issues have just blown up, and they're directly staring at our face, and we need to actually account for them and deal with them. So the existing relationships, they will need professional support. In the living relationships, what's important to understand is what the lockdown has done is there are lots of unprecedented and kind of surprise turn of events. Let's look at each one. Work from home. Each of us, before the COVID, work from home sounded very exciting. Now we are allocating small spaces in different parts of the home, and that's become the office space. The next part is that every day has merged into another day. So you don't have weekdays and weekends. It all seems to be one sort of many days. You're just kind of, it's become gray. So then we have these days, weekdays merging into weekends. We really don't have this kind of clarity that Monday to Friday is work and so the weekend is personal time. So we have the merging there. Then what we have is our time. Just the clock itself has become completely gray. There are people who are working from home who have actually shared that they wake up in the morning at 6 o'clock and they're going through the mails, etc., the emails they want to answer. You're also those who are working across countries have erratic hours. And we are also finding we're sitting in spaces that are actually ergonomically not good for our bodies, because it's not designed for work from home. Now this is going to cause a whole lot of stress. Next part, personal space has, again, what is personal and what is professional, because we are all, cooped up and locked up in the home, again has blurred. When do I move from my personal role to my professional role? In addition, if we have children in the house, we have to manage their schedule, because if you have school children, they're having online class, etc. Now, third thing, when we are working from home, a lot of us had staff to support us. Now, staff can't come into our house. So we have the additional work of domestic management. Okay. Much as we like to think, all these things were really not really discussed as to who's going to do what task. So among couples in relationships, very often and most often, one person is feeling more burdened than the other. And therefore, there's a lot of issues in all this. Now, also what's happening is that in addition, as we discussed earlier, because of the COVID, there are other economic issues that all of us are going to face at some level. Maybe the impact is different for different people, but there are so many, it's like a coming together of so many issues in such a short time. It's not given us the breadth and the pause to actually put these in various buckets and deal with it. So really imagine what all we are trying to cope with, and therefore it will impact relationships, because we end up at the end of the day feeling unsupported, or maybe one person is doing more, one is doing less. All of us have all these virtual telephone calls, virtual discussions, so we need quietness, and some people have space, some don't have so much space. So everything is kind of amplified. And that is causing a huge burden on what I call living relationships. Having said that, the advantage for living relationships is we can have these uncomfortable conversations, and we can bring to light some of our difficulties, our individual difficulties, and actually re-collaborate and restructure each one's tasks, and also put the task in such a way that it's not one individual who's bearing more, and therefore also understand that we have to remember that we need to identify and have some boundaries even between our professional and personal.
Okay, very quickly, I want to move on to, we've diagnosed a lot of, well, not diagnosed in the clinical sense of the word, but in a conversational way, we've kind of highlighted a lot of issues that people might be facing at this point in time, and you've very helpfully, sort of delineated them so that they can become recognizable and they can come to the forefront. And once they do, people will look for solutions. So I want to move on to solutions. Before I do, one last issue that I wanted to address with you very quickly is of two other emotions that people could be experiencing at this point in time. Perhaps one could be guilt, which is something that we don't realize very often takes a deep toll on us, especially if it's sort of chronic or perpetual guilt that could be coming out of not, working from home and not taking care of our kids enough, or the fact that some of us are separated from our loved ones. My parents are alone in Calcutta, they're old. I don't know when I'll be able to see them again. So there are all these kind of, experiences. And then, of course, we're seeing these reports of people starving on the streets, etc. So it's a very, very difficult time, and we could be experiencing guilt. And the other thing could be denial, because which perhaps is a stage of grief, because you spoke about grief earlier. But there might be lots of us who are not really acknowledging that the world as we knew it may be altered forever. They're just living from deadline to deadline. So, okay, the lockdown was extended until the 3rd of May. So there's a part of you that intellectually understands it, but there's another part of you that's like, everything will go back to normal on the 3rd of May, which is probably not going to happen. I just wanted you to talk about these two sort of feelings that people could either knowingly or unknowingly being fostering.
So let me start with guilt. Guilt is an experience that we have when we believe that we've not lived up to an expectation, or we've not fulfilled some responsibilities that we believe that we needed to do, or that we've not actually managed the situation appropriately. And very often what happens with guilt is, this guilt in a way takes over our inner critic, and that inner critic is this chatter, this voice in the head, and it keeps actually beating us, saying, you hear this voice, your inner voice saying, you didn't do this, you could have done this way, almost like a fault finding person living in your head. What happens with guilt is, we're feeling guilty because somewhere we have not accounted for the context. Let's look at just what you shared. And since you gave the example, you're living in Delhi, your aged parents are living in Calcutta, and it's very, very natural and normal for you to wonder when you would see them. And yet your current context is, you cannot travel to Kolkata because of the situation, but you feel responsible. So what happens in guilt is, this is coming because there are certain beliefs in our system that we may need to actually examine so that we minimize the guilt. For example, I don't know what you hear it can be, as a daughter, and I need to look after my aged parents. As a daughter, you will look after your aged parents, but you need to have the context for it. So we need to actually revisit those belief systems. That's for guilt. To me, denial is actually destruction, emotional destruction. And the reason I say that is when we live in denial and we do not account for contextual realities, what we are doing is we are not encouraging ourselves to feel and experience what we are feeling because of the context. And therefore, when we do not allow these vulnerable feelings to actually be acknowledged, we are then what we are doing is we are creating a place where we become emotionally rigid. When we become emotionally rigid, we do not have the capacity to become resilient, which is actually emotional agility. Okay, now, just as you said, this is COVID, there's been lockdown. The reality is that when we emerge May 3rd, whichever day, we need to account that their life is not going to be the same. Okay, let's look at a simple thing. Now, even when we emerge, we will be there will be that fear in us. Am I going to get the virus? Who is a transmitter? So, say we are going to emerge being hyper vigilant, which means that the context has changed. Okay, it's important for us to account for realities, because when we don't account for realities, all these vulnerable feelings that we've not acknowledged actually gets encoded in our system. And once it's encoded, as I said, these feelings and these issues morph and come out as other defense behaviors, which can be harmful not only for the individual but also for society and community. And we can see these social issues coming, Pragya. There's going to be, just look at even the migrant population, starvation. There's going to be much more aggression in the community because it's a survival need. Starving, it's physical survival. There is going to be much more addictions, whatever the addictions are. All these issues are symptoms of, or symptoms that are showing that there were rooted causes that were not addressed. And I think the way forward for us post the COVID is actually, we need to start accounting for these realities. And we cannot live in this gray, I call it a gray bubble, thinking that when we go back, life will be the same. Because when we return back in post-COVID, we need to follow the natural progression of growth, which is we need to take these small steps and start again, start building again.
A question that follows from this, and now this will also sort of move us in the direction of talking about solutions, is that a lot of our minds are what in lay terms I will call sort of hardwired, right? Where we don't exactly on a day-to-day basis live the examined life. We have become used to responding, and we have a set of sort of stimuli that come our way every single day, and we're used to responding to them in particular manners. What this lockdown has done, what this global pandemic has done, is just ruptured that sort of routine that we had and the comfort of reactions and responses that we had gotten used to. For example, where does our relaxation come from? Where do our joys come from? Where does our stress come from? And going forward, we frankly don't know what the shape of the world will be. Maybe the lockdown will continue. Maybe it will not continue. Maybe it will be a reduced lockdown. Maybe we'll be in cycles of lockdown. Maybe there will be, like with the Bombay flu, a much more virulent strain that comes in autumn and leads to a more severe sort of, locking down and stress. How can we start moving towards what a beautiful phrase that you used, which is psychological and emotional agility, to be able to sort of unlearn things that we've learned and adapt to whatever circumstances we might be faced with for a very, very long time to come. What might be some simple steps that we can take to do that?
So I would say that one is that you need to take, I would look at the steps of taking care of your physical hygiene. Physical hygiene is the kind of foods you eat, just to maintain emotional agility, because food affects mood. The amount of caffeine, although I'm drinking the coffee, I have to say there's something I keep thinking, is the intake too much? Physical hygiene in terms of exercise. And exercise, while of course yoga and meditation is wonderful and people can do it, they can, but even some sort of physical stretches, some movement, it's required for the mind and the body. So the physical aspect and meditation. The next part that I would look is mental hygiene. And mental hygiene for me is, mental hygiene takes place when we spend at least 10 minutes a day in self-reflection. Okay? Self-reflection is not to attain nirvana. Self-reflection is just to revisit experiences the previous day, because every experience, there is some output or some observation or learning. If we actually reflect and observe, and observe, there is some little nugget that we can take that will help us to move forward. That is the power of self-reflection. What self-reflection then does with you, it is actually enables you to account for contextual realities. And when you account for contextual realities, you are then free, psychologically free to problem solve. This helps you in mental hygiene. Now, when we talk about emotional agility and resilience, which is bouncing back, what all of us need to do is we actually need to reboot our psychological system so that we are able to resume and bounce back and build our lives in the new normal. And that is why I come back and encourage every person in this audience that denial is really destruction. Because what is the way forward is to own our own truth, because in the end, our own truth is what is sustainable. And when you own your own truth, it becomes sustainable, because then we are able to empathize and have human connect. Pragya, I believe that post-COVID, even leadership, whether it's leaders in civil society, whether it's leaders, political leaders, it's important to have empathy. Empathy is the need of the hour.
I'm going to ask you just one final question. I hope everyone will listen to this conversation over and over again. Even if I may say so myself, for your words, obviously not for mine, and take notes. One final question from me, which is that you said a number of wonderful things that we all need to be doing right now. And I'm certainly going to aim to do some of them, if not all of them. But some of us might not be able to help ourselves at this point in time. Could you tell us what might be some of the signals that we need to heed and understand that we are unable to cope at this point and need professional help? Because all of us are feeling distress. Some of us might be beyond a certain limit. What might be some signals for that?
If you are not able to cope and contain, and when I say cope and contain, and you experience yourself as unable to concentrate, getting agitated for things that you previously didn't get agitated, you are restless, you're unable to sleep, your sleep patterns or your sleep cycles have changed, and you don't feel a general eating actually your eating habits are a wonderful indicator, because we eat excessively or we undereat. It is a symptom. These are all and are symptoms that we are not able to cope and contain. And I would encourage people then to take support, because and support can be from friends, but the first step, and for me support is about acknowledging vulnerabilities, because we human beings need human connectedness. We are relational animals. I would end with that. And I would end with one statement that I still believe COVID 19 and the lockdown is a time of apocalypse and not catastrophe. In apocalypse, there's crisis and change, but there will be hidden revelations which are very potent and powerful for each of us.
Well, that's some silver lining. I could talk to you for millions of more hours, but we're out of time. So I'm going to call it a day here. Thank you very much for talking to us.
Thank you, Pragya.
Thank you, Roli Pulse and Roli Books, for giving me this opportunity to have this conversation. For those of you who are listening, you should follow Roli for many more interesting conversations on all their social media platforms, and tune into more conversations from Roli Pulse. Thank you very much. Thank you, Doctor. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.